I am ready to present to you my favourite 24 original scores released in the year 2024. I keep trying to make this process easier by preparing more. I probably listened to more music in the last year than any other period of my life, but it didn't help. The more I listen to, the harder it is to decide what ought to be on this list. But as is the case each year, I've ultimately landed on a list that I feel really good about and that I can't wait to share with you. I adore every piece of music you'll be hearing in this video. So let's dive into it. As always, I'll be playing a little bit of each score before revealing the title, both so that you can listen to it without expectation or judgment, and also because then it's a bit of a fun guessing game. So without any more ado, we start with number 24. Well, it's a colourful and delightful Michael Giacchino score. He's very much in his Pixar mode here, cutesy melodies with playful instrumentation, whistling and upbeat. It never really gets very complicated or intricate, but it's very pleasant and in places effectively touching and nostalgic. The only downside is that on album, this one struggles to really get going. There are great statements of themes, but even on the sweet tracks, they struggle to take off into a really satisfying cue. That said, beautiful short statements are better than no statements at all. The highlight of this score is this courtly sort of Baroque canon, lulling us into a sense of security and order. It sounds like progress, but underneath there's certainly a sense of irony, of farce. In other places, this film score also features some strange, twisted material with modulating strings and trance-inducing percussion. Some distorted screams in places as well, just to make sure you're really discomforted. It's a memorable score for a disturbing film. This is a surprisingly sweet and tender score that... Actually, no, the sweetness and tenderness wasn't the surprising part about The Dry 2. What surprised me is how epic and sweeping it can get. The relatively contained mystery movie here didn't necessarily beg for such scope, but this music leans into a heightened sense of melodrama in a way that I absolutely love. I'm also delighted to have something Australian on the list this year. Rare for me. Anne-Kathrin has been on my radar since The Devil Conspiracy, and this was my favourite score of hers that I heard in 2024. She's done well here working with a film that was clearly using temp tracks from things like Pirates of the Caribbean and maybe some other remote control scores. And when I hear something that's clearly following a temp, emulating the pattern of a cue that I'm much more familiar with, I become very interested in how this composer has made their music different. And even in those tempy places, Woodwalker's is plenty original. Its main themes are full and rich and blanket the whole score in magic. I love the warm, heavy strings. All in all, Woodwalker's is rather wondrous and wonderful. We've already had Michael Giacchino, now let's have his son, Mick Giacchino, who presents in a similar style of music. There isn't a massive orchestra on this score, but the instruments sound really good. Mick Giacchino is clearly benefiting from some family expertise in giving character to the orchestra. But yeah, this is deliberately more intimate and smaller in scale than The Batman, though it continues many of the same musical ideas. Disturbing, psycho-esque strings, for example, are used to great effect. The main motif for the penguin is a simple little two-note riff, like Hans Zimmer's Batman theme. It's an instantly iconic identifier, and it all culminates in a really wonderful, frantic, chaotic, powerful main theme. Now, this is an interesting one because since it's a musical, we kind of need to clarify, am I talking about the score or the songs or both? Well, I'm here doing this video because I'm a fan of orchestral music primarily, so that's where my focus is on Wicked. And John Powell and Stephen Schwartz have made a really luscious, colourful score in that regard. It has really wonderful moments of incredibly detailed, expansive composition. Some of the most beautiful moments in a score this year. The only thing that doesn't let it reach really great heights, in my opinion, is the fact that it's clearly connected to a musical. So anytime the orchestral score feels like it's building to something, it doesn't quite get there. There's nothing there because it's been building to a song, which is over on the other soundtrack. So that handicaps this score a little bit, but still, some of these tracks are pure magic. I'm still pretty new to being a fan of the music of the Call of Duty series, but a couple of years ago, Bear McCreary's Call of Duty was my favourite score of the whole year, so I'm pretty on board for each new release. And Black Ops 6 by Jack Wall reminded me in some ways of how entertaining I found that Bear McCreary one. This is a big and propulsive score, lots of musical ideas, really energetic and pulse pounding. Occasionally that becomes too much for me, a bit of a wall of sound, so to speak. But throughout the album, there are points where I think the mix is just right and it feels like a big action blockbuster. Now to a much less popular game, to say the least, a game that failed so spectacularly that you can't even play it anymore. Thankfully though, we get to keep Daniel Pemberton's score, which is super charming and energetic. It sort of does the Overwatch thing of having some contemporary rhythms and some classical heroic motifs on top. But I'd say Concord actually leans a little more cool and modern compared to Overwatch's sometimes kooky retro style. Either way, it's certainly good at hyping me up. There's nothing like a bit of Rachel Portman to tug on your heartstrings. Here with John Ehrlich too, we have a classy drama score that I really enjoyed, especially when it goes big, when it soars, it's really something. When that main theme kicks in, your heart explodes. And that's just Rachel Portman, that's how it works. Putting this above Wicked is probably a little controversial, but for me, that Christmas was the John Powell music that most delighted me this year. It's whimsical and Christmassy and gets just as playful as any of the best John Powell scores from over the years. And it's yet another reminder, as if we needed it, of just how agile John Powell's writing can be, with cues that jump from idea to idea without ever feeling too busy or directionless. As all John Powell fans know very well, when it comes to melody and leitmotif, he's just one of the best in the business. Gareth Coker has created a lot of music for the Ark series of games over the years, but now here he is doing a score for an Ark animated series. He's brought over many of his great existing themes, and he continues to flesh out this bombastic landscape. I just find all of the music in this series so enjoyable, so listenable. And to contrast with some of the bombast, there's some really delicate, gentle, romantic material here too, which surprised me a bit. Technically, this release is labelled as Volume 1, but I don't believe there's been a Volume 2 yet, which is fine. This release is over 3 hours long. There's so much to enjoy. This is one of those soundtracks that's kind of impossible to summarize. It is many hours of music, and not all of it is great, and a lot of it is in styles of music I don't really enjoy, but so much more of it is great than needs to be, and some of it is out of this world. Of course, as a reimagining of Final Fantasy VII, this sees the return and reinvigoration of some of the greatest themes in the history of video games. Many of the reiterations are beautiful beyond words. My only worry is finding the time to listen properly to all of it. Prince of Persia. Now, this game score has a little bit of Hades about it, with some electrifying, high-tempo beats. It's got some really cool tracks. And when it comes to the main theme, which is my favourite part of the soundtrack, its presentation can be so huge and enormous, like the example you've just heard. I didn't expect Prince of Persia to sound like Ark, but thanks to Gareth Coker, that's sometimes the case. Prince of Persia is higher on my list here than Ark, because overall I just found this to be a bit of a newer and fresher experience in 2024. Blake Neely has some big shoes to fill in this follow-up to Band of Brothers and the Pacific, and I think he really pulls it off. This is exactly the sort of sentimental World War II soundtrack that I was hoping for going in. It combines some gloriously wistful patriotic sop with some really tense and exciting action cues. It's really what it says on the tin, and that is a great thing. And that brings us already to the top 10. Here we go. A dark and brooding score here for a season of House of the Dragon that's all about the inevitable escalation of war. And there's actually a recurring motif in the score that exactly represents that theme, sometimes in the form of this foreboding, wailing female vocal. It's really raw and tragic. A lot of the soundtrack is quite bleak, similar to previous Ramin Djawadi Game of Thrones music, but it's still full of standout pieces of beautiful montage and intense action. This one came out of nowhere for me. I'm not familiar with the game or the composer. It's really exciting though, brilliant musical storytelling. You don't need anything but the music to start seeing vivid images. There are clearly a lot of inspirations here, but what immediately jumped out to me is some very big Ludwig Göransson Black Panther inspiration, particularly on a couple of action cues. But hey, again, being able to see a clear line between this and its inspirations doesn't negatively impact my enjoyment in the least. This is just a gorgeous and vibrant soundtrack. I never thought a spiritual sequel to Brian Tyler's Transformers Prime soundtrack from 2012 is something we'd get. But here it is. Brian Tyler even references those great old themes. But anyway, even if you don't already love the music of Transformers Prime, Transformers 1 is so great. Brian Tyler gives the Transformers such profound nobility in his iconic, long-winded melodies. There are a few things that I love more than a big melodic Brian Tyler blockbuster score, and this really is another good one. Some really, really big, heavy brass here too, and that always gets me. Between Transformers 1 and Young Woman and the Sea, this is definitely the most uplifting, inspirational section of my list. This score is really wonderful, it's magical and beautiful, it's got a bit of Enya DNA in there, and there aren't many 2024 scores I can say that about. In a couple of brief little moments, the orchestration even reminded me of Justin Hurwitz's First Man, and that's just an all-timer for me. Anyway, solidly entertaining album, end to end, only gets better with each listen, and that's why it's this high on my list. It's funny, these days Hans Zimmer's presence is felt so keenly across the board. On film scores he had no direct hand in, so it feels strange to actually come to one that's got his name on the cover. And the thing is, and what's clear in Dune Part 2, is that the Hans Zimmer of today is quite different to the Hans Zimmer we've heard in the past. He uses many of the same elements and techniques, but Dune is much more minimalistic and experiential than a lot of his most famous scores. We know from interviews how passionate he is about this particular story and how personal the experience of creating this music is for him, and that really comes through in the music. It's full of so much feeling, saying so much with at times so little. The piece you just heard is, for me, the most heartbreaking piece of the year. Zimmer's Dune Part 2 may not be eligible for an Oscar, but it's eligible to be high on my list. Now, my top 5 leans very much in a certain direction. See what you think. Helldivers is mad fun. Talk about Starship Troopers on steroids. It's an upbeat, rousing action blockbuster with a cheeky sense of irony that never gets in the way of just being fun. I remember Murray Gold talking about comedic music once, and that tough balance of knowing when to lean into the comedy and when to play it straight. Well, for the most part, Wilbert Roget II plays this perfectly straight, and I think that's the right approach. He gives himself full permission to lean into the naive, capitalistic heroism. This album is on the shorter side of things, but it's just some of the most fist-pumping fun I've heard all year. I haven't played the main theme for you here because I like to find a great track that's a little more off the beaten path, but if you haven't heard the main theme for Helldivers 2, check it out. It's been stuck in my head all year. If you know much about my musical tastes, you know that I can never get enough Warcraft in my ears. It's just one of the great musical landscapes, inspired by all of the greatest epic fantasy music of decades past and taking it in bold new directions. And after a couple of slightly disappointing soundtrack releases, I think The War Within is a return to form for the series. It's packed full of new ideas and it's beautifully recorded. I listened to this album on repeat for a couple of months in 2024 and it helped me get through some challenging work. I find that music like this with this much character, magic and heart is just a perfect companion through difficult times. Yep, it's another game score featuring Wilbert Roget II. I'm obviously a sucker for some Star Wars music, but its combination with contemporary styles in recent years has been a bit hit and miss. I'm not one of the people who thinks Star Wars always needs to sound like John Williams, but I do think many attempts to leave that classical romantic style behind have been fairly disappointing. Here, however, I think they found a great balance. Star Wars Outlaws references some Williams themes, surprisingly appropriately, like its use of the Imperial theme from A New Hope, but for the most part it's original and exciting and taking us into new areas of the Star Wars universe. I think one thing it does so well is keeping a sound that's a little unusual, a little alien, a little not of our world. That allows the composers to incorporate modern elements without it losing all of the Star Warsiness. Basically, it's so cool. another game score. It's a little surprising to me to have the new Dragon Age this high on the list. I mean, the series has always had great music, particularly Inquisition, I think. But when it comes to this entry by Hans Zimmer and Lorne Balfe, well, let's be real, mostly Lorne Balfe, I just liked it way more than I anticipated. And in terms of measuring a score by how much fun I've had with it, how much enjoyment I've gotten out of it, well, from that perspective, Dragon Age The Veilguard deserves to be here at number 2. The main title theme, which is heaps of fun and probably where Zimmer's influence is most prominent, actually sounds a lot like Junkie XL. And not in a bad way. It's like Junkie XL's Batman or Mortal Engines. It's pretty over the top, in a fun, not annoying Junkie XL way. There are a lot of recognizable modes of Lorne Balfe here. Some his dark materials in the thematic shapes, a bit of Mission Impossible grandiosity, and a whole lot of Skylanders. This really is basically Skylanders with a bigger, darker palette. And overall, much more upbeat than I'd expect from Dragon Age. In the end, this score just has a whole lot of tracks that I really enjoyed many times on repeat, and I was thoroughly entertained. Almost feels like a cop-out. I tried to find anything that could knock this off the number 1 spot, but I couldn't. For me, the Rings of Power is just head and shoulders above everything else out there. The score for the first season blew everything else away. Some come down was to be expected in this follow-up, and yes, it retreads a lot of the same territory, which isn't quite as novel this time around. But the leitmotif writing on this is still just so good, and it's full of wondrous new ideas like the powerful theme for Run and the delicate sounds of a Region. Meanwhile, themes from the previous season are refreshed with some of their best presentations yet. So it's so good, and it's just like last time, there's so much of it as well. It's extensive. And I mean, in terms of strong themes, great orchestration, and satisfying cohesive cues, Rings of Power continues to be my favourite music of recent years. Phew, there we are. Another year of this down. As usual, I feel a bit bad about all the things I couldn't fit on the list. I haven't even put on the Lord of the Rings movie, or the Indiana Jones game, or the Gladiator sequel. There were about half a dozen scores that during the year I felt, when they came out, I felt super sure would be on this list. So I even wrote up little blurbs about them for this video, but they ended up not fitting on the list. So there you go. Let's see, what else? There was a pretty even split across categories this year. I had 6 TV shows, 9 movies, and 9 video games. But the top of the list leaned pretty heavily into the video games, and I guess that's just largely where I found the most musical entertainment this year. Movies was down big time from last year. Last year I had 14 film scores on my list, and only 1 score on my list this year was nominated at the Academy Awards, that being Wicked, though that's not unusual. I can't remember ever really agreeing with the Oscar picks. Interesting to note the double-up composers this time round. Having John Powell twice isn't that surprising, but I wouldn't have expected necessarily having Wilbert Roget II at spots 3 and 5. Hans Zimmer's name is there twice on Dune and Dragon Age, but Really, I do think of Dragon Age as a lawn bath score. And I just always love to see the surprises that come out of nowhere for me each year. Like, I had never heard of Tales of Kenzera until a couple of months ago, and even now I know nothing about it except that I like the music. It's so much fun to expand the pool of things you love, and in the end, the music that pierces our cold, hard shells each year isn't a science, is it? It's a mysterious wonder. Thanks for joining me to the end, and if you like this sort of thing, why not check out mutantreviewersmovies.com. Leave your thoughts below, and let's meet back here next year. Same time, same place, same task. See ya.